This is the discontinuity thesis. This is Appendix I. What would refute the thesis? This bonus episode is not another step in the main argument. The 7-part sequence has already made the case. This appendix does something different. It sets the standard for how the argument can be attacked. If you are listening rather than reading, keep one question in mind: what would actually prove the thesis wrong? The answer is not a vibe, not a discomfort with the conclusion, and not a reminder that history is complicated. A real refutation has to touch a load-bearing premise or show a mechanism that restores the wage-demand circuit under the conditions the thesis describes. The discontinuity thesis is not a single-point forecast. It is a structural argument with empirical premises. It can be refuted by showing that one of its load-bearing premises fails, or by showing that a mechanism exists which preserves the wage-demand circuit under the conditions the thesis describes. This appendix specifies what would count. It is published as part of the sequence so that critics can engage the structural argument at the level the thesis is making its claim. Refutation is welcome. Refutation that engages the structural mechanism is more useful than refutation that engages a strawman version of the thesis or a comfortable subset of its claims. Start with the 4 premises. The thesis rests on 4 structural premises and 1 conclusion. Each premise can be challenged. The conclusion follows if the premises hold. Premise 1: unit cost dominance is being crossed. AI plus verification produces a substantial and growing fraction of professional cognitive tasks at lower unit cost and equal or better quality than human-only production. The benchmark domain overlaps heavily with the cognitive work that sustained middle-class absorption. Premise 2: task dominance propagates through interface collapse. AI is not confined to isolated task outputs. Once models operate across software interfaces, task-level dominance becomes workflow recomposition, which suppresses hiring, breaks training ladders, and reduces mass absorption without needing whole occupations to disappear at once. Premise 3: the propagation cannot be restrained as a competitive equilibrium. No actor or coalition operating within current institutional structures can prevent the propagation at scale. Restraint is dominated at the worker, firm, sector, and state levels under the competitive conditions that obtain. Premise 4: no available preservation route restores the wage-demand circuit. Category-based regulation fails as circuit defense because the assistance replacement boundary dissolves inside workflows and AI as capital in motion migrates across legal categories. Structural alternatives preserve consumption rather than productive necessity. Friction slows propagation without restoring general-purpose cognitive labor as mass scarcity. Conclusion: the wage-demand circuit is no longer self-reproducing under the new technological condition. Post-war wage capitalism has lost its reproduction mechanism. What replaces it is a successor system, and the question is which successor arrives, who designs it, and on whose terms. First, what would refute premise 1? A successful refutation of premise 1 would show that AI plus verification is not crossing unit cost dominance for a substantial fraction of professional cognitive tasks. The refutation would need to engage either the quality condition, the cost condition, or the workflow condition. A quality condition refutation would need to show that benchmark performance does not generalize to deployed quality, that the benchmark domain does not overlap meaningfully with mass cognitive labor, or that the trajectory of model capability has stalled in a way that prevents further crossover. Citing residual categories of work AI cannot do: care work, embodied work, trust-bearing roles, does not by itself refute the premise because the thesis already grants these as exceptions and addresses them as residual scarcity rather than mass absorption. A cost condition refutation would need to show that verification, integration, and oversight costs systematically consume the entire raw cost advantage for the relevant class of tasks. This requires engaging the verifier cost arithmetic in Episode 1, showing that some specific deployment is more expensive than the human-only baseline does not by itself refute the premise. The premise is about the trajectory and the class of tasks, not about every individual deployment. A workflow condition refutation would need to show that the deployed cost of AI plus verification systematically fails to undercut human-only production in the benchmark domain. The most credible version of this refutation would draw on enterprise deployment data showing that AI deployments routinely produce equivalent total costs to human-only baselines. Second, what would refute premise 2? A successful refutation of premise 2 would show that task-level unit cost dominance does not propagate into workflow recomposition. It would need to show that software interface fragmentation remains a durable labor moat, that compute use and tool use capabilities do not generalize into enterprise workflows, or that the cost of integrating AI across interfaces routinely consumes the task-level advantage. Showing that jobs contain residual human tasks does not refute the premise. The premise does not require whole job replacement. It requires enough workflow recomposition to suppress hiring, break training ladders, and reduce mass absorption. The strongest refutation of premise 2 would be evidence that interface-level capability has stalled in a way that prevents propagation, that frontier models cannot reliably operate desktop software, navigate browsers, manipulate files, or sustain multi-step workflows across applications, despite continued investment and capability progress at the task layer. The OS World Verified, BrowseComp, and Tau2 bench telecom trajectories track the relevant capability. A trajectory reversal across independent benchmarks would constitute a premise 2 refutation. Third, what would refute premise 3? A successful refutation of premise 3 would identify an actor or coalition that can credibly restrain the propagation, and would specify the mechanism by which the restraint becomes a stable equilibrium rather than a transient delay. The refutation would need to engage the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma at all 4 levels. Worker-level adoption happens below the level coordination can see. Firm-level deployment is competitively dominant. Sector-level coordination is undermined by adjacent entrants and platform substitution. State-level coordination is undermined by competitive pressure between states. Citing historical precedents for technology coordination, Basel, Paris, WTO, nuclear nonproliferation, chemical weapons, Montreal Protocol, does not by itself refute the premise unless the refutation engages why the conditions that allowed those precedents do not obtain in the AI case. Episode 3 covers the precedent comparison directly. Citing the existence of friction, regulation, liability, integration cost, professional gatekeeping does not by itself refute the premise. Friction modulates timing. Episode 7 addresses the friction as rescue argument and shows that drag is not equilibrium. The strongest version of a premise 3 refutation would identify an enforcement mechanism that survives the competitive structure. This requires showing how observable defection and credible enforcement can be sustained when defection is internal, diffuse, continuous, and high reward, and when the enforcers are also the actors most exposed to the cost of restraint. Fourth, what would refute premise 4? A successful refutation of premise 4 would identify a specified mechanism that preserves the wage-demand circuit through the propagation. Preservation means maintaining mass productive necessity for the majority of working-age adults at socially sustaining wages, where subsidy, protection, artificial scarcity, makework, or political mandate are not the primary source of the wage relation. Post-war capitalism always contained stabilizers. The welfare state, public employment, industrial policy, collective bargaining, public procurement, and unemployment insurance all redistributed purchasing power outside the immediate wage relation. The question is whether those stabilizers supplement a labor market that remains primary or replace it. Preservation requires the first condition. The thesis claims the technological condition has shifted such that the second condition obtains. The refutation must engage all 3 of regulatory mechanisms, the within-face heap paradox problem and a cross-face categorical recursion, structural alternatives, the synthetic wage problem, and friction-based delay, the propagation modulation argument. There are 3 versions of that challenge. A regulatory refutation would need to show that some category-based instrument can defend the assistance replacement boundary as a wage-demand circuit defense, despite the heap paradox gradient inside any single use, and despite the across-face migration the deployed object exhibits in response to category selection. Citing regulations that succeed at other purposes, fraud, safety, liability, documentation, does not refute the premise. The thesis is scoped to circuit defense specifically. A structural alternatives refutation would need to show that direct compute ownership, mandatory wage share redistribution, public deployment, or sovereign AI funds preserve the wage demand circuit rather than producing a successor system that delivers consumption without productive necessity. The refutation must engage the synthetic wage distinction in Episode 6. A wage maintained by political obligation after productive necessity has ended is a transfer routed through payroll, not the wage demand circuit. A friction-based refutation would need to show that some specified form of friction is both permanent and sufficient to restore mass productive necessity rather than merely modulating the timing of its erosion. Episode 7 addresses the friction inventory directly. The refutation would need to identify a friction that does not decay, route around, or merely redistribute the deployment across time. The strongest positive refutation would be durable mass complementarity. The strongest refutation of the thesis as a whole would be evidence of durable mass complementarity. AI adoption increasing the marginal value, wages, bargaining power, and career mobility of ordinary workers across the affected cognitive labor market, rather than concentrating gains in capital owners, senior verifiers, platform firms, or protected incumbents. If AI deployment caused broad-based wage growth, entry-level expansion, restored training ladders, and rising labor share in exposed sectors, the thesis would be wrong. The mechanism would have failed to operate as the thesis describes. The wage demand circuit would be observably self-reproducing under the new technological condition rather than failing. The refutation must show mass complementarity, not elite complementarity. Evidence that some workers use AI well does not refute the thesis. Evidence that the median cognitive worker in an exposed sector is gaining bargaining power, wages, or career mobility does. The Stanford Digital Economy Lab data on early career employment in AI-exposed occupations is currently the most direct labor market test, and the trajectory it shows is consistent with the thesis rather than against it. A reversal of that trajectory across independent measures would be the empirical signal of mass complementarity. This is the refutation path most useful for empirical observers. The other premises are largely settled in their empirical foundations and are now under structural debate. The mass complementarity question is open and will be answered by the labor market over the next several years. Now, just as important, what does not count as refutation? To prevent the appendix from being read selectively, the following moves do not by themselves refute the thesis. Each is addressed in the main episodes. Each is a comfortable answer that does not engage the structural mechanism. Pointing to residual cognitive work that AI cannot do does not by itself refute the thesis. The thesis grants this. Residual scarcity does not preserve mass absorption. The threshold is majority economic agency, not the last worker. Pointing to premium human niches, high-end legal, bespoke medical, artisanal production, luxury services, does not by itself refute the thesis. These exist, they absorb thousands or tens of thousands per category. Mass labor absorption requires hundreds of millions globally. The arithmetic does not close. Citing slow deployment timelines does not by itself refute the thesis. Friction modulates timing, slow destruction is destruction. The successor system question arrives whenever the propagation completes, regardless of speed. Citing the existence of welfare states or redistribution programs does not by itself refute the thesis. Post-war capitalism contained redistribution. Welfare states supplemented a wage market that remained primary. A post-AI redistribution regime replaces the wage market as the source of mass demand. The distinction between supplement and replacement is the discontinuity. Citing political possibility of new policy does not by itself refute the thesis. The thesis does not predict that no policy response will arrive. It claims that policy responses preserve consumption rather than the circuit. That is a structural claim about what redistribution and ownership do, not a forecast about what is politically achievable. Citing benchmark imperfection does not by itself refute the thesis. Specific benchmarks have specific limitations. The thesis does not claim any single benchmark is decisive. It claims that the trajectory across multiple benchmarks GDP Val, OS World Verified Tau2 Bench Telecom and the labor market evidence Stanford early career employment data jointly support the propagation. Refuting any one benchmark anchor does not refute the thesis. Refuting the broader trajectory across independent measures of deliverable quality, interface operation, deployment cost, and labor market absorption would. Pointing to the messiness of history or the unpredictability of the future does not by itself refute the thesis. The thesis is structural. It claims that the mechanism operates under specified conditions. The mechanism's operation does not depend on the future being smooth or predictable. It depends on the structural conditions continuing to obtain. Recommending softer framing may be rhetorically prudent, but it does not by itself refute the thesis. A refutation must show which premise fails or which preservation mechanism succeeds. Calibration of language is a separate question from validity of structure. Evidence counts when it attacks a load-bearing premise. Isolated examples that do not engage the structural mechanism do not. So how should a serious challenge be structured? A serious engagement with the thesis should specify which premise or premises are being challenged, identify the mechanism being proposed in their place, and address the main episodes that cover the relevant material rather than the summary version of the argument. Refutations of Premise 1 should engage Episode 1, Refutations of Premise 2 should engage Episode 2, Refutations of Premise 3 should engage Episode 3, Refutations of Premise 4 should engage Episodes 4, 5, 6, and 7 in combination, since the regulatory, structural, and friction-based refutations interact, and a successful refutation must close all three. Engagements that improve specific claims, identify scope discipline failures, correct empirical points, or sharpen the formulation are valuable even where they do not constitute refutation. The main episodes have been improved by such engagements across multiple rounds. The thesis is open to further such improvement. A note on the current empirical state. As of May 2026, Premise 1 is substantially closed by vendor-published evidence. GPT 5.2 marketed as the first model that performs at or above human expert level on benchmark professional knowledge work. GPT 5.5 at 84.9% wins or ties on GDP Val, 78.7% on OS World Verified above the 72.4% human baseline, 98% on Tau2 Bench Telecom, deployed Verif, cost arithmetic confirmed in case study, including Novo Nordisk and OpenAI's own internal codex usage. Premise 2 is substantially closed by the deployment evidence, workflow execution operating at scale across regulated and high-stakes sectors, with named CEO testimony from deploying organizations and the senior figures of the model providers themselves stating the structural claim in their own words. Premise 3 is structurally closed by the multiplayer prisoner's dilemma argument. Premise 4 is structurally closed by the successor system, and drag is not rescue arguments. The current refutation space is narrower than the appendix structure suggests. Refutation now requires either a sustained capability trajectory reversal or a deployment trajectory reversal at scale. Neither is observed as of publication. One final clarification: what this appendix is not. This appendix is not a contractual challenge or a prize structure. It is a published refutation standard. The reason for publishing it is to make explicit what the thesis would have to lose to be wrong. A structural argument that cannot specify its own failure conditions is rhetoric. A structural argument that can specify its failure conditions is a position that can be debated. The thesis is a position. The appendix is the standard at which the position can be debated. Anyone who engages the standard in good faith with serious work contributes to the intellectual project the thesis is meant to advance, whether or not their engagement results in refutation. The thesis is not the final word on AI and labor. It is a structural claim about why post-war wage capitalism is no longer self-reproducing, and an attempt to force the policy debate into the question of what comes next. The refutation that would change the position would show, with reasoned argument and evidence, that mass productive necessity can be restored under the conditions that actually obtain. That refutation has not been produced. The evidence has moved in the opposite direction. The thesis has shifted from forecasting a discontinuity to documenting one in progress. So the standard is simple but demanding. Show that one of the load-bearing premises fails, or show that mass productive necessity can be restored under the conditions that actually obtain. That is Appendix I of the Discontinuity Thesis. What would refute the thesis? The next appendix covers the common false refutations, the arguments that sound like engagement but do not touch the mechanism.